This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 73, Ionic Applications. I'm your host this week, Danny Blue, and with me as always is Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
And with us we have Mike Hardington from the Ionic team.
Hello.
So Mike, thank you very much for being on with us this week. Real quick, can you just give us a recap of, initial
A little for a
overview.
recap.
I'm getting very much so ahead of myself. Tell us who you are, what you do, what you like.
So my name's Mike Hardington. I work for Ionic. I'm a developer advocate, kind of jack of all trades. I hop around from team to team just doing whatever I need to do. Go around, give talks, and write demos and loads of documentation. From Rhode Island, so it's a small state. If you've never heard of it before, it's that little piece of land wedged between Connecticut and Massachusetts. So if I start dropping my R's and start talking like a guy from Boston, it's not my fault. It's the accent.
Nobody blames you. New England is a
It's a
distinct
very
place.
lovely place.
Awesome. Okay, so you work for the Ionic team. For anybody that doesn't know, what is Ionic?
So Ionic is a set of components built on top of Angular that make making hybrid apps a lot easier. It's essentially all the UI controls, toggles, navigations, animations, and gesture support that typically a native SDK kit would provide. We can now provide for the web.
And that is it. It is all on web. So you said a hybrid application, and again, so for any of our listeners or viewers that aren't aware, so a hybrid application is a mobile application built with a native web view.
Right. I think you guys did a great episode with Brian LaRue quite some time ago. The PhoneGap, yeah. So it's like PhoneGap, Cordova. It's a native web view. So on iOS, it's mobile Safari. On Android, it's Chrome, and we use that as the rendering portion of it, and everything else like your UI and interface, it's all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Right, which helps. The idea is to also help make it easier so you could just take, if you have a responsive application and you just want to put it on the App Store, you can throw it into something like Cordova and have it wrapped up as a quote-unquote native application. So Ionic is built on top of Angular and built on top of Cordova. I don't really know of many other competitors to Cordova that are out there, at least none that have that type of mindshare. The front-end framework community, however, has a lot of opinions about things. So to the best of your knowledge, why Angular for Ionic?
Angular it has a lot of traction, especially the 1.0 version. There's a lot of people behind it, a lot of momentum, and it's one of the toolkits that out there. It just comes with everything that you need. You don't really need to, go out there and install a bunch of different dependencies to fetch some data and display it on a page. Angular ships with everything that you need to write your services, write your application logic, and display that and render it. You don't need to go jump through any other hoops. It's a little bit of a learning curve at first, but once you get those concepts, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. So can anybody that has previous Angular experience, do you think it's super easy to jump into Ionic, or are there maybe some other things that you have to learn before, or other things you should learn before jumping into it?
No, actually, if you know any Angular, it's pretty easy to just pick it up and go right into it. Funny is that even if you don't know Angular, it's still super easy to pick up and jump right into it. I mean, when I first found Ionic, I didn't know any Angular. I think I had just started looking at blog posts saying maybe I should learn this Angular thing. It seems to be the cool kid on the block for now. And then I found Ionic and I was like, okay, well this actually makes learning Angular a million times easier because all the complicated concepts that Angular has have been kind of made simpler using Ionic.
Very cool. So something that I think everybody that builds hybrid applications or is thinking about building hybrid applications has to think about is performance. So rendering large lists, animations, especially on Android, tend to be really kind of like sticky wickets for a lot of stuff. And one of the arguments that a lot of people use why you should go native instead. So what are some things that Ionic does specifically to handle performance issues? I'm specifically interested in animations because just the way that the two different web views handle CSS animations can cause you some problems.
Right.
Where sometimes iOS will sometimes seems like it's doing things one after the other, so they seem like they're going smoother. But then on Android, it's trying to do everything at once. So for example, trying to animate in a full page view and animate something inside of the view at the same time, which just causes it to chug at an unbelievably slow rate. So what are some things that Ionic does to help prevent some of the, not just prevent, but to give good fluid experiences on mobile?
So, I mean, at the core of it, it's just good code that is well tested, and we physically test on device to make sure that all the animation, all the performance of the entire code base is up to par on a physical device and not just inside of a browser. For specifics, we provide Crosswalk through a Cordova plugin that you can use on Android to take like those old, maybe not so great Android devices and actually give them like a decent Chrome browser instead. So a lot of those issues that you kind of described have to do with the fact that Android like 4.1 to 4.3 used WebKit, but it was like a really old, really kind of crappy version of WebKit that didn't really perform well, had never been updated since maybe since the initial release in 4.1, until 4.4 came out, where it was like, okay, well, we're going to replace the system web view with Chrome. And on 5.0, they're like, all right, well, now we have the system web view as Chrome, and we're just going to keep updating it. So anytime we ship a new release of Chrome, you get that. So for 4.1 and 4.3, you can use Crosswalk. So essentially, it's an embeddable web view based on top of Chromium. And what that does is it'll replace the default web view in Cordova and give you Chrome, so that way you can have like proper JavaScript execution, more up-to-date web browser that can handle complex CSS animations, and make sure that everything's at least up to par.
And it's hard to be up to par whenever you're building on the native platforms, isn't it? I mean, I know a lot of people say, oh, it's much easier, you have one target, but it's really not the case. I mean, with things like Crosswalk, it makes it a little nicer on older versions of Android. But building, on native platforms with Cordova, obviously it has its ups and downs. And you guys have a lot of tooling around that, correct?
Right. We make sure that we make the whole process nice and smooth, and you don't have to dig through pages of docs to figure out how to do everything. Everything that's kind of shipped has all the safety flags turned on.
And as a web developer, I mean, is it hard to get? I mean, is it a great departure when sort of using Ionic, to do these sorts of builds? Like if I have an existing web application and I say, you know what, we're gonna wrap this sucker up and deploy it into the app stores of du jour. What's that process look like for the average developer?
So that process is a little bit of a different standpoint, because you think about it, a mobile responsive website does not make a mobile app. So they have their own specific design language and design language interactions. The user is going to expect that to behave a completely different way. So if you have an already existing Angular app, say something that you created, and now you want to bring to the App Store, all those services, all those high-level points, where you're fetching your data, those can all just be ported over and added to this app. Where things are going to require you to actually do a bit of rewrite would be, say, those specific views, that are mobile focused. Your controllers, if you want to access any native functionality like the device's geolocation API, the Bluetooth API that phones have, those are where inside of your controller you're going to want to have very specific versions of that.
So, again, so very specific versions, very specific, mobile focused stuff. So Ionic is the UI layer is one of its big things.
Right.
It also has this build system, which in some instances seems to just be a proxy for some Cordova commands.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also know that like if you use one of the like one of the pre-built ones, there's a few build hooks that are already written, for example, that add whatever your platform target is. So if you're building for iOS, it will add an iOS body class to your app to help you to help Ionic style everything correctly, but then helps you target things down specifically. And you mentioned plugins as well. And again, anybody that's maybe not real familiar with this process, so if you use Cordova on its own, it really doesn't do much. They've since I don't remember which version it was, they modularized the entire thing, so everything is a plugin. If you want to, they said Bluetooth. If you want to access Bluetooth, you have to use a plugin. If you want to access the flashlight, you have to use a plugin. And a big one for me is that Ionic has is the keyboard, which a lot of people might not really think about until they run into a lot of really annoying problems with the keyboard. And I've talked to other native developers as well, and the keyboard is a problem for native development as well. So are there any other things that the keyboard one is big because it will give you the height of the keyboard, and it will give you events to listen to for when the keyboard is open and closed, and it will let you manually open or close it if you need to. And getting that height of the keyboard is really, really big.
Except it doesn't do it too well in Android because that API is actually not available.
Oh yeah.
So we have to do our best and just hope that we're gonna guess the keyboard height beforehand and then check after the keyboard is open to make sure we got it right.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of weirdness, but that is I think a good example of a particular pain point that had to be solved with native code.
Right.
So like that could not be solved with web code. There's nothing there for you to do. Are there other examples of plugins that Ionic has written, or that you know of that are those that are problems that can only be solved natively?
Yeah. So we've only written the keyboard plugin, and by written I mean we forked it from the official Cordova keyboard plugin, modified it, and made it much simpler. So that way, it just reported the events and sizes. Before it was doing this thing where it would actually shrink the entire web view and then open the keyboard. It was a bit of a hack. So we forked it and kind of simplified it for our purposes. But other plugins that people that fix what the web can't do. If you think about like any kind of storage on the web, we have like web SQL, IndexedDB, local storage. We have all these different solutions that not every single one of them work in a consistent manner. You don't have like, I think you have IndexedDB works on Safari and then it fails on a couple different other platforms. Cases like that. So if you think about like we have web SQL, okay, well that doesn't work everywhere. Well, we can use SQLite plugin. So all the devices, because we are actually embedded on the device, we could create a full SQLite database, and use all of our storage there. If we want to read and write to the actual device's file system, we can use a plugin and do that. Or if we want to connect to different types of devices, like maybe an Arduino, you can use the Bluetooth serial plugin and actually scan for any devices that you could connect to and send commands to that.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that's native folk, and so again, so this kind of sits somewhere. Ionic kind of sits somewhere in the middle. So it's the UI part. You still need some native code, whether it's through a plugin or self-written, to do some things. But then what about just the web side of it? Could you potentially build? So like I think NFL.com is not a responsive website. It's an MDOT site. So if you're on a mobile device, it serves up the mobile version. Could you use Ionic to build just a regular mobile site that you weren't planning on using with Cordova, or is that something that you guys wouldn't really recommend?
It's a gray area, because if it's a specific like MDOT site, you could do it because it's responsive markup anyway. So even if you were to load it up on a full browser and not like a specific MDOT site, you will get everything to resize correctly. You'll still get all the animations, but everything will still work. And that's kind of benefit of it being web tech, is that it will just work in Chrome. As far as having mobile specific sites, you can totally do it. There are some cases where things may not work 100%, because things like swipe to go back, that's going to interfere with the browser's built-in capabilities. We thankfully disable that on if we're not inside of Cordova. Animations may be another thing. Sometimes it's not. You just get conflicting kind of terms. Is it a site or is it a mobile app? And the user may feel some kind of disconnect.
Okay, so before we move on to some other larger things, are there any specific components or services that Ionic provides that you just think are like, man, this is the best. This is the reason people should use this, or this is the thing that people will be the most impressed by?
I know mine was the side menu when I first found it. So like I was using was it jQuery Mobile way back in the day when that was a thing to do.
It wasn't good.
It was fine for its time, but as soon as I tried to like throw it on an old Android 4.1 device, I could see it just chugging along and trying to do something. But when I first found Ionic, I found like their side menu component. I was like, okay, that looks smooth in like an animated GIF. That could be just sped up or something. And then I actually threw it on a device and could like hold the device and then drag it and then watch it just follow my finger. I was like, this is awesome. Why isn't this being done everywhere else? It was a pure excitement moment, because like, well, this is something that I thought was incredibly hard to do, and these guys did it like right out of the box before they even hit like a 1.0 alpha phase, and it's like, okay, these guys got my vote. I'm gonna keep doing this. Everyone should check this out.
Yeah, no, that one's pretty good. I personally, for me, the first one that I saw that made me think like, oh man, this is gonna be pretty cool, is the pull to refresh, which which is a staple on any mobile app, but is kind of annoying to do. And this leads me into kind of another, maybe a bit more technical part of Ionic, is that in order to do pull to refresh, you somehow have to be doing something weird to it to make that work. And Ionic, at least in its current version with the current UI WebKit for iOS, does JavaScript scrolling.
Right.
So it's not native scrolling. So you're actually, the entire view is actually being scrolled with JavaScript as you go. Can you speak a little bit to, again, in these I don't know if you would know these things or not, but like how you came to how the conclusion was made that we can't let the browser do the scrolling for us. We need to handle it on our own, because I also know now in certain versions of Android where you have the correct scroll events, you can choose to turn JavaScript scrolling off and use the native scrolling. On iOS, you have to use the JavaScript scrolling. But what was the main reason that that decision was made? Because that doesn't sound easy.
No, it's not an easy decision, and I think you've already kind of answered it a little bit. It's the fact that the browser just it didn't have the proper events that we needed to do anything kind of compelling. So, things like pull to refresh or um, infinite scroll, or another component that we have, collection repeat, where we're so heavily dependent on being able to track scrolling. Um, that's stuff that the browser just didn't have. Some versions of the browser still don't have that, and so JavaScript scrolling is like, all right, well, if we're going to do anything that people would want, like pull to refresh or anything kind of compelling, we need JavaScript scrolling. And JavaScript performance at that time, when that decision was made, it's still really good. So it wasn't like a 2012 or 2011 where you don't want to use like a JavaScript scroller because that's just not going to perform well. It's like, well, no, we have somewhat decent devices out there and they can handle this. Thankfully on like newer versions of Chrome 4.4 or Android 4.4 and up, we actually get scroll events, so we can disable JavaScript scrolling actually automatically for you, and still have things like pull to refresh and infinite scroll and have them work. And I think in new versions of iOS with WK WebView instead of UI WebView, WK WebView actually reports proper scroll events. So we're still testing that out and hoping to get that in and disable JavaScript scrolling for WK WebView.
That would be pretty awesome, because you can turn it off on your own now.
Right.
And just to experiment at home, I would look at it. You can do a bunch of different configurations with Ionic up front, which is really nice because you can turn things off by platform and things like that. But try it out and see the difference between the native scrolling and the JavaScript scrolling, especially on Android, where you can try out the pull to refresh, because it does behave a little bit differently with the native events than it does with the JavaScript scrolling. So it's an interesting A and B comparing how these two work with the home rule JavaScript scroll versus the native scrolling.
Yeah, and with the UI stack that you guys have now, I mean, you guys have a pretty deep sort of stack of components. I mean, what do you guys sort of have in the horizon for more components? I mean, obviously, do developers need more on sort of the native mobile hybrid of things? Or are you guys focused purely on sort of the perf of the existing components moving forward?
So we're really encouraging other developers to, if not make their own components, create components for other people to use, and then we have our own market site where if you create a custom menu, for example, if you want to put that up on the market and give it away, sell it, or do whatever you want with it, it makes sense to put it there because while it's highly specialized and it may be interesting, it doesn't make sense to have it in the core of a framework. So kind of something that we've been thinking about moving forward with is how can we make the core of Ionic pretty small, modular, and if you only want a few things here and there, that's all you're going to get, and you don't need to have all these components for all these super specialized things that you're never going to do.
I need one of two things before you guys completely completely write it off just to the community. I need to either be able to animate views up and down, which I know is not up and down is not the most performant thing you can do, but I need to be able to do either up and down, or I need to be able to do nested animated views inside of a modal. And there are so many threads about this.
What a wonderful segue, because that is stuff that is super easy and a breeze to do in Ionic 2.
Segue. Oh, I love it. That wasn't even on purpose. All right, so with that, yeah, like let's talk about Ionic 2.
Ionic 2, yes. Tell us more.
So this Ionic 2 thing, I hear they're coming out with a second version of Ionic. It should be pretty cool. So Ionic 2 is going to be coming out where it's kind of in like an unreleased alpha stage right now, but it's up on GitHub. People can play around with it, pull it down, and look at documentation. But it's essentially everything that we learned from Ionic 1 applied to a new framework and built on top of Angular 2.
And so I think that's the big thing that a lot of people should also. So it is a fairly large departure. So is this one of those other things where it's kind of Ionic in name only? They said you're taking some of the same lessons, but you're not really porting any Ionic 1 stuff over, are you? It's like it's all kind of getting redone?
There are some cases where we've actually been able to just kind of copy and paste and port it over to Angular 2 code. But I think a lot of the things that people are going to be happy with is that because we're higher up on the abstraction chain, we're kind of in between the developer, and Angular 2. The transition between Ionic 1 to Ionic 2, you end up deleting a lot more code. And being able to just couldn't do that in Ionic 1. Oh, that's a breeze to do. Like those navigation inside of a modal. That's so easy to do, and being able to have a single view be loaded from anywhere. So if you think about like the iOS App Store, there's like a million different ways that you could get to an app's page. That's a breeze to do in Ionic 2, and it's something that we really thought about and like tried to make sure that our routing and navigation were so powerful but super easy at the same time. So that way people aren't banging their heads against the wall trying to figure out how to do this stuff.
I'm not kidding. So anybody that thinks that I'm just being dramatic about this, go try to do that now.
Actually, no, because that's a good point, because that was a question I had before I even joined the team. Was I want to create some kind of sub navigation in the side of a side menu, like if you think the Mail app on iPad. If you go to like a threaded message, you get a list of all the possible replies that someone sent. I was trying to figure out how to do something like that just on a whim, and it was so hard to do, and it ended up becoming just like, all right, well, I'm not really routing, I'm just showing and hiding and animating things. And with Ionic 2 and everything that we've learned from V1, this is a breeze to do. And having kind of these concurrent navigation views that are actually loading their own separate history and maintaining them separately without one of them interfering with each other, it's a breeze to do.
No, that is very good to hear. Well, like you said, that's what my solution. There were some people that did the same thing where I could talk for the rest of the episode about this piece, but so there is a modal, which is responsive. So like if you are using it on a desktop, it looks like a normal modal, but then when you're down to your phone size, it slides up from the bottom, which is a pretty common interaction. So the current version of Ionic does not let you animate views up. So if that's the interaction that you're looking for, the best thing you can really do, or the most out-of-the-box thing you can do, is this modal. But that modal has a bunch of other things about it, so it's really hard to make it to have other. So he's like, okay, I want this to pop up, and then it's my settings menu, and I want to be able to have its own little sub-navigation. And the solution that we had to come up with was pretty much, show and hide these different things, and then we can manually animate them in and out and try to maintain some sort of state that way. So that's good to hear. So Other than it being built in Angular 2, what are the big changes with Ionic 2? Other than that routing thing, which sounds awesome. And with that, are you using the component router that they've been working on for Angular, or are you doing something else?
So I'll answer the routing one since we're already on that. We're kind of treating routing and navigation as separate things. So normally in like a V1 app, you navigate based on a URL, and then the internals of UI router would route you to that specific page based on the URL that you gave it. We kind of flipped that around and said, no, just load this component, and then when I get there, I will tell the URL what I want it to be or what it should be. Um, we're using our own solution right now with the component router they have in V2. We are trying to get that to work and fit into the stack. So that way you could just, if you wanted a URL, you could have it. But since these are mobile apps, URLs are a bit irrelevant, I guess. No one's going to be doing like a force refresh inside of on their device. But it is something that we are trying to that we are working on, and we're in contact with the Angular team and getting help with that as we keep going forward. The other drastic changes, well, not really drastic, is just the separation of how components, how to go from like views and components. So I think, and it's kind of related to the navigation changes as well, kind of. Where Angular kind of came out with this at component annotation that you give it like a template, a directives, and then a class. If you think about it, that's the same way. That's the same thing as saying, here is my state, and then here's my state's controller. And I think that's something that it's intimidating at first, but once you think about it in a simplified way, it's easy to migrate over. Animations are being completely redone from the ground up using this cool API called the Web Animation API. And if no one has ever heard of it, I'm doing my open source kind of job of saying, go look at the Web Animation API. Rachel, was it Norbers or Neighbors?
Neighbors?
Yeah, she did a great talk about it.
We've had her on the show to talk about the Web Animations API. So you should also go listen to that if you haven't.
That too. It is a great API. It's baked in natively on Chrome on Android. So Android, which normally would have spotty performance with animations, now has this baked-in functionality and can handle animations like a beast. iOS, we have a polyfill in place, and what we're finding is that the animations on iOS are on par with what we have on Android. So performance for these animations are, really good on both platforms, and you can do all these crazy things. So if you want to do your up and down animation, or if you want to do the total retro like iOS or iPhone OS 3 flipboard animation, you could totally do that, and it'd be a breeze to do.
Awesome. I agree. The animation API is awesome. Like just having request animation frame is so good. And if anybody else is just interested in that, that's also the way a lot of people are building 3JS things now as well. They're using that as their render loop.
And it gets the web animations polyfill is actually being pretty heavily worked on at the moment. You can find it on GitHub if anybody's out there who wants to look at it. And that's really cool because it is a great API. But the kicker with great APIs is that they can be complicated sometimes. And anytime there's a new version, things like Ionic 2, is there a lot of developer strain on that move? Angular 2 is a departure in some cases from 1 in certain ways that it addresses things. Do you see developers having problems with that?
I think any of the problems that people do have at first, it's It mostly just comes from a misunderstanding of the syntax. So when you think about it, if they go from these views and controllers to components, it's they think it's a big shift, but they're actually really similar. So if you follow things like some of the best practices, John Papa's or Todd Motto's style guides, where you're using things like controller as, um, you're keeping all your views and components kind of modular, where all the associated files are together in their own directory. Porting an Ionic 1 app to Ionic 2 ends up being really simple. And I was talking with someone on Slack a little bit earlier, and they're saying, yeah, I had a production app in Ionic 1, and I ported it over to Ionic 2 in maybe an hour, hour and a half. And that was just me digging through docs trying to figure out things as I was going. And it ends up becoming you're deleting a lot of code that you just don't need anymore. Like the entire state provider, that's gone because everything's just their own independent component.
That's my favorite thing to do, by the way, in case anybody out there wants to know. I love deleting old code. That's like my favorite thing to do. And like, oh, new version. This is a good time to clean shop.
When you can go onto GitHub and see your commits and just see a whole bunch of red, it's like, this is a lovely feeling.
Well, it's that thing where you refactor something and you manage to do more with it with less. It feels like you're going against the laws of physics somehow. It's like, I am a god.
I am developer expert. Hear me roar.
That's very cool, and that's good to hear. Not just for Ionic, but just for Angular as well.
Yeah.
Justin, do you have something else?
No, I agree. I think that anytime, I think big changes always look daunting. Sometimes they are. Obviously, everyone should take a step back and evaluate, as opposed to, just jumping at, oh, the world is ending sort of approaches to things, which most of the time, realistically, the world is not ending.
Most of the time.
It is our job to write software, whether that's a port or not. So, we hope. But it sounds like, Ionic 2 is going to be pretty tricky. I mean, are there other features in the pipe that, I realize is being worked on GitHub, but, I mean, are there other things that we can really expect in Ionic 2 that are going to be pretty awesome?
So if you've done anything in Ionic 1, we had this component called collection repeat. So this was like Ionic's 1 kind of our shining component. It's like, oh, look at what we have. We have collection repeat, where it would imitate, I think, iOS's table view. So as you would scroll, it would just take elements that are being scrolled off the screen, move them down to the bottom, update their data, and have those kind of recycled. And we would cache all the data and everything, and so you could have like maybe a list of 1,000 items and have no jank at all as soon as you're scrolling, and things would render super fast.
Unless you have images in those views, and then it will cause you some issues, but that's your fault.
There's ways that you can configure that and force refresh. With V2, we're renaming it virtual repeat. So essentially, it'll do the same thing that collection repeat did, but it's going to work with native scrolling. So that way, we can use those scroll events and create highly performant scroll views, and make sure that we're keeping that DOM nice and compact.
Cool. So collection repeat is a big one, because that's one of the things that native is very good at, that web for mobile isn't as good at, which is just having a really, really long list of stuff. So having like an infinite scroll with the collection repeat, with the pull to refresh, all that kind of stuff, you kind of feel like a wizard putting all of these things together.
As you should.
Am I a wizard? Have I always been a wizard? Remember talking around like that guy. All right. So Ionic 1 to Ionic 2, seems like again, so pretty much building on top of a new framework, but it seems like it'd be pretty easy to port your your Ionic 1 applications to your Ion 2 applications, depending on what you're doing, obviously. Is there a possibility of ever seeing Ionic on a different platform? Like, is it possible we'll ever see like an Ionic React or something like that? Or are you guys pretty sure of your decision with Angular at the moment?
We're pretty sold on Angular. If not for the reason that Angular, like I mentioned earlier, Angular is one of those solutions out there that it's like batteries included. You go ahead and you can open up that brand new toy and everything I need is already in here. It's got a nice HTTP module. I can have my states. I can start routing. I don't have to think about all the low like kind of things that make an app work. I can just use Angular's included modules and just know that everything's going to work for me. I focus on my app and I can be productive at the end of the day. That's all that matters.
Cool. So we have like roughly 15 minutes left or so. We have to ask the big question of native versus hybrid. And
so we may want to schedule that for another episode. That's going to be a never-ending debate.
So I want to make this quick, but I always want to ask everybody that is in this space about it, because it is such a, I think, sometimes misunderstood and heated debate, where the idea of having something cross-platform sounds, maybe to your boss, to the CEO, to your CTO, whoever, that seems to be like, this is the way to go because it's so easy. One code base, 2 applications, and it's perfect. And that's just not always the way that it works. So really what I want to get at is, when is Ionic, specifically Ionic, which is hybrid, when is Ionic a good choice, and when is Ionic not a good choice? And then how do individuals or companies go about determining which path they should go down? I know that's a lot in one piece, but we can kind of break it down as, when is Ionic a good idea?
So if you think about it, 90% of apps out there, like in the App Store, and are just basic, at some level, they're a CRUD app. Handling data, deleting data from a database, and pushing new items up. That's really all the function. Everything else on top of it is just kind of, fluff. But at the end of it, that's where a lot of apps lie, and that's where Ionic really shines. We're not talking about making these crazy 3D realistic RPG games with dragons and everything. This just web technology is not specialized at that. There are really good APIs in the native stack that are specialized to handle creating complex 3D renderings. But if you just need to create like a business app where you're passing off a fleet of apps to salespeople and they're just handling updating contacts to a database, why would you want to go ahead and build that in iOS, build that using Objective-C or Swift, and then go ahead and rebuilding that using Java? It makes much more sense to utilize web code and just have that work across platform.
So with that, when is Ionic or hybrid not a good idea? You mentioned, intense 3D graphics and things like that, but that can't be the only reason that you would go native only.
It depends on your shop. Graphics or any kind of 3D rendering is obviously one of them. But if you have a shop full of Java developers, you're not gonna give them JavaScript and here you go, have a good time, get something done by the end of the week. They're just not gonna want to work in that. They'll figure out something else. So obviously when the web just can't do it and the people that are actually making the app, the developers, aren't web programmers. Ionic is built off of web technologies, and if you're a team of web designers and web developers, you're not going to ask them to write really low-level C or Objective-C. Same thing on the other side. If you have a pretty good team of Java or Objective-C developers, You're not going to ask them to write an app using web code.
Well, and it's a series of trade-offs, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes down to engineering of any type, what trade-off can be made against time, cost, and features? Like you say, it really depends on your shop, and it also depends on your deploy target. If you've got a company full of Android devices, well, maybe it does make sense, depending on what particular APIs you need to do Java. But if you've got a stack of web developers with an existing web application, maybe hybrid's the way to go. Maybe progressive web apps, which are on the horizon, are the way to go. It would be nice to be able to wrap them all in a bow and say this is the one way to do all the things. But we don't live in that world. We live in a very complicated world with devices that exist, and then other ones that you were pretty sure were dead and still do exist. I saw someone with a 3G iPhone the other day. Didn't even know they, it doesn't work for me.
It could be worse. It could be worse. 2 years ago, a year ago, there were still brand new devices being shipped with Android 2.3.
This is true, right?
Let that sink in for a little bit.
Yeah, you look at the Android browser on 2.3, and it makes you want to cry, or at least I still have nightmares. Or you look at, and this is the problem, right? I mean, you end up in a situation. Is that your 3 right there? You just got a 3 hanging around your desk, Danny? You just. I have honestly, my 3 is too far to reach. I can't reach it. It's in the box in the other room.
But I have my 3G in my desk drawer, and I just can't find it underneath all the crap.
I can see my 3G example was a horrible example now. The 2.3 example was way better.
Yeah.
But
It was.
yeah, I mean,
But the point is that yes, I reached into my drawer and I got this out. I could give this to someone, and they could probably use it. So
probably, but again, see, the kicker with any sort of deployment of targets, though, is that you're going to have varying degrees of experience, right? I mean, even, let's take an older device, right? You can write native code for an older device. Doesn't mean that it's going to perform like super awesomer, right? You're not necessarily going to get these same sort of things, right? New native platforms have newer APIs. Cordova hooks to a lot of those newer APIs in a hybrid state that give you more features that the web platform is just now getting, like Web Bluetooth, right? So it is I listened to the argument, and the argument is so nuanced, right? There's no black and white answer. It's just a series of trade-offs you decide to make based on what your shop does to deploy, because at the end of the day, you got to ship.
Right, and there is no right answer for any of it. It's like you said, it's all dependent on the shop.
But my boss has told me that I need to come up with a concrete way to identify which direction that we need to go for a given application. Is there, like, the way it sounds, there's not like a flow chart or like a choose your own adventure type thing of, like, do you need to do this? Yes. Okay. You answer a series of questions and you come out at the end with this is absolutely what we should do. So is there anything like that? Like, is it even possible to come up with that type of thing to have a concrete example or a concrete solution or a concrete decision on the direction that you're going to go?
Case studies. I mean, you can always look at somebody's case studies of like how they did a particular deploy, right? I mean, you look at things like Ionic. Ionic's got a lot of case studies of like, here are deploys that people have done and they've worked well for X. You could say that's things for other Angular apps or React apps. There's a lot of apps out there with studies of things that had deployments against X feature sets with X amount of users and load. Because at the end of the day, it's somewhat about data. I mean, strictly sitting there and deciding, I mean, and it is a disconnect, right? You end up in a scenario of, well, management doesn't understand what necessarily what the user set is using, and then you try to make a flow chart of like decision trees of like, we're going to build using X, and it doesn't match because the data set from the actual users wasn't taken into account. The flowchart's going to cheat you, right? It's going to say, and then you're just going to end up with an angry boss going, "Why is no one using our app? Sorry, boss, no one uses Windows Phone." I'm sorry, it didn't work out. My 2 cents.
No, I think that's good. And anybody else have anything? Because I mean, I agree. We got anything else to add on that aspect? Is that it just
I
look
think
at what other people have done?
I think that's hits the nail on the head. Is look at what other people have done, but also look at who are you trying to target? Are you a small startup trying to get like an MVP out there and just have something out there that works on both platforms and works well? Maybe look inside of web technologies. Are you a big enterprise, corporation where you can control every single device that people are going to get, and your developers are well trained in Java? Maybe you should start looking at writing in Android, in native Android. You can't. There is no easy answer for this.
And I think that's the answer to my question. Then is it just there? It's terrible to answer something with "it depends," but that's exactly what it is.
Exactly.
And I'm sure everybody is tired of hearing, the development group saying, "Well, it depends." Yeah, but that's honestly just the way that it is sometimes.
That's half a development right there. Well, it depends on what you're trying to do.
Or just saying no. depending on how lazy you feel on that particular day, right? Because that's what most of the time when things go bad, right? It's just developers being lazy.
Exactly.
Just sip your coffee real slow and then sigh deeply, and then kind of shake your head, and then I'll have to think about it. You get to the whiteboard, draw some arrows.
We've been talking about some Flux stuff that we're doing for something to work today, and I've drawn the Flux diagram like so many times on so many different walls at this point. But the lazy developer thing, I like. This is complete sidebar. Comes up in like game development a lot. Like whenever a game comes out and it's buggy or something like that, people just immediately jump to, oh well, the developers were lazy. Which is almost never true. But sorry, yeah, that didn't have anything to do with anything. But that's okay. Conversational podcast is what we'll go with. All right, Mike. You have any you have any closing statements? We are expecting a speech. You did write a speech, right?
No, I did not, but I'm pretty good at improvising on the fly.
Yeah. So give us what did we miss? We obviously missed. We've glossed over something. We've touched something too high level. What are the things that you want to tell people that we totally missed out question-wise?
So if you want to give Ionic 2 a try, go to ionic.io/2. We seriously want all your feedback, and if you think it completely sucks, please provide constructive feedback. If you think it's great, provide positive feedback and buy us a beer maybe when you see us. But we just want people to try it, and we want people to really give us their opinion and tell us where we can improve, tell us what works or what didn't. All of our services that we had that are going to keep the company funded, push notifications, live code deploys, that way you don't have to resubmit through the App Store. Give those a try. Those are still in alpha and free while they are in alpha.
And that's actually one thing that we didn't touch on, and we won't go into now, but one thing that everybody should try out is that the Ionic build tools do let you do live reload on the device.
They do.
Which is a very cool thing. I think that's technically still in beta, but it works surprisingly well. You have to do some proxy stuff.
Depending on your setup, actually it should be able to work if you just do Ionic run iOS -L. That's like the live reload flag, and the same live reload that you get in the browser will work on the device.
Yeah, which is really cool and enormously helpful. So you don't have to rebuild each time, so that's just an awesome thing. It's awesome that that's a free thing as well, because that's something that a lot of people would charge for. But unfortunately, we are running into the end of our time. Thank you again so much for joining us. If people want to get in touch with you, if they want to contribute to Ionic or any of its subsequent projects, how would they do so?
So if you want to get in touch with me, I'm essentially M Hardington everywhere. So HARTINGTON. It's the most boring user handle ever. first name, last name. But if you want to contribute to Ionic, github.com/driftyco/Ionic, and then for Ionic 2/Ionic 2. Send your PRs. We love PRs, and even if it's just a spelling fix, we love those as well. All PRs are equal in our eyes.
That's awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of Ionic. It makes it really easy to do a lot of cool stuff, a lot just things you don't have to think about, like the pull to refresh thing and the side menu. So very, very cool. So thank you very much again. So this has been episode 73 of the Web Platform Podcast, Ionic Applications. As always, I'm Danny Blue.
And I'm Justin Roberto.
And we will talk to everybody next week.